All right, thanks guys, and thanks for being here, and for everyone that's tuning in. This is pretty cool. There aren't that many places that just offer free speakers, all right? You used to have to pay or sign up for something to do it, and so I love that Listen You just provides this, because the speakers have been great, and I think what's been the most fun is just getting to know each other as we come week after week, because you're my kind of people. We're each other's kind of people, right? Because we're here. And same goes from all of you tuning in, especially the Canadians. I love Canadians. I first became aware of tonight's speaker about 38 years ago when he was born into our family. He's my brother, Justin. And Justin is a lawyer, a trial attorney, an educator, loves to speak, to teach. He's a father, husband, a great guy. Apart from his Juris Doctorate degree from ASU, he also has a degree or a certificate in advanced classical history. Did I say that right? He's really smart about history, especially studying on the classics, so ancient Greece, Rome, a lot of those. And more than anything, if I could tell you something about Justin, is he's passionate about teaching. He is incredibly, I like history a lot, and I think I'm good at history, and I know a history, and then I get into conversations with Justin, and I realize that I am a toddler in the realm of history. And it's hard to find someone who can take history with all of its complexities and bring it into something interesting and applicable to us. So most of us go to junior high and high school, and most people hate history because it's just facts and boring. And Justin has a great way of making all of that come to life. And he truly believes that when you study the lives of great men and women from history, that you can make your life better. All right, that success and greatness leaves clues behind that we can study and that we can learn from them, that we can apply to our lives. So I'm really excited to introduce one of my heroes, Justin Heap.
All right, let's see if we can. We have our slides here today. We'll wait for just 1 second. There we are. Okay. So as Chris told you, I'm an attorney and a writer, but my greatest passion in my life has always been history. And I think I got this from my dad. In our house growing up, my dad had a literal library with books floor to ceiling with history books on almost any topic. And as a kid, I used to love to go in that room and pull down those books and sit and flip through them and study. My dad gave me my first copy of Plutarch's Lives of the Famous Greeks and Romans when I was 12 years old. And I remember reading those stories and really loving this cast of characters and these people. And so I had a somewhat different childhood. While other kids dreamed and imagined about playing pirates or cops and robbers, right? I dreamed about standing on the deck of a trireme, right, as it crashed through the waves at Salamis. Or marching as a legionary as Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon towards Rome. For me, these weren't just ancient characters. These were real people, right? That with great lives, men who had done great things. And then as I grew up and I studied history in high school and college and listened to disinterested professors give boring and dry lectures about history, I realized that we don't teach history anymore. At least we don't teach it in the way that the ancients did. If you were a student in the ancient Roman Empire, right, one of the most important things in your education would be the study of the biographies of the great Greeks and Romans, to study the lives of great men. They didn't think of it as history. They thought that by studying the lives of these people and these great events, that could be a guidepost for success in our own lives. If you wanted your child to succeed, you told him to study great men, so that they could mimic what those great men had done. And so in that vein, I'd like to talk tonight about one of the most famous battles in human history, right? And that's the Battle of Thermopylae. So in the 400s BC, There was a one lone superpower on the earth, and that was the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire controlled all the land stretching from the Indus Valley in India to the cataphracts of the Nile in Africa, from the deserts of Arabia to the steppes of Russia, and from western China all the way across the Hellespont into Europe, into what is today the Balkans and Bulgaria. It was the greatest empire that the world had ever seen at that time, comprising almost all of the civilized and known world, and all of it was ruled by one man. An emperor named Xerxes. And in 480 BC, Xerxes set out on a great campaign. And he called in troops from all parts of his empire. And he brought them together. The historian Herodotus says the army was as much as 1.7 million men strong, one of the greatest armies that had ever been assembled in the history of the earth. And this army set out with one goal: to crush the tiny city-states of ancient Greece. And yet, as he passed over into Europe and marched down towards these city-states, he found his way blocked at the pass of Thermopylae by 7,000 Greek patriots who had stood up to defend their country and hold the pass. And they were led famously by a Spartan king named Leonidas, with 300 Spartan warriors. Now, that story and the history of that battle has rung through the ages. There's been many great last stands, but none of them speak to all the generations like Thermopylae did. And even today, that story still rings for us, right? It still inspires television shows and novels and even feature-length films about Leonidas and the 300 Spartans and the stand that they made at Thermopylae. For those of you who are interested in fitness, you'll know Spartan has also become a known word with the most grueling and difficult of races, right? Endurance races are called the Spartans, right? Spartan races. So, who were the Spartans? In order to understand Sparta and these men, to understand their king and their people, we need to understand the world in which they lived and what their society was like. And I'm going to try as best I can to take you back to ancient Sparta today and help you to imagine yourself as a person in Sparta. Now, if you go to Greece today, like most people, right, more than 1 million people every year visit Athens to go see the great Athenian Acropolis and see the great ruins that remain at Athens. And Athens was one of the greatest cities in ancient Greece. But if you take the road across Corinth to the Peloponnese, you can see the other great city, and that's the city of Sparta. And if you visit Sparta today, you can see the ruins of the city, and what you'll find is an empty field. In the center of the city, where great men used to argue and decide the fate of Greece, an olive orchard now grows. The Greek historian Thucydides would famously write that if anyone came to Sparta in 1,000 years and looked on its ruins, they would never believe that this had been one of the greatest cities in ancient Greece. But I actually don't think the Spartans would be unhappy to see their legacy, the legacy that they left behind. Because the Spartans famously always bragged, other cities build monuments. Sparta builds men. And one of the reasons why Sparta remains so fascinating for us today is that this little city in Sparta, which is there in the Peloponnese, that's that western peninsula right here, in a place typically called Lacedaemonians, right? The Lacedaemon is the name of the region, right? Unlike most Greek cities, it's landlocked in a little valley with high mountains completely surrounding it. But why it holds such a fascination and why we care and are interested in the Spartans today is I believe that the Spartans did something that was perhaps unique in the history of the world. Many nations the world over have met together and tried to decide what kind of government would we have to rule over us. Think of our own founding fathers and our Constitution here in America, right? Many nations have done this. But Sparta did something very different. Sparta asked a different question. The ancient Spartans asked, what kind of person do we want our society to produce? And then they structured their entire society to bring about that person that they saw as that perfect human being. So what did it mean to be raised in Sparta, right? What did they view as the perfect person? Well, the Spartans viewed the person as a virtuous warrior, right? A soldier that was physically perfect in every way. And if you were raised in Sparta, you would train and exercise relentlessly to achieve that physical peak of perfection. The Spartans were honest and virtuous. They were both admired and feared and looked on with some confusion by the other Greek states, but everyone acknowledged that the Spartans did whatever they said they would do. And that they had a great moral authority that even dwarfed their military might. And finally, the chief value of a good Spartan was that he was willing to sacrifice everything for the good of his people and for his sake. So what would it be like? I want you to imagine yourself now, 2,500 years ago, and you're a child born in Sparta. So what would it be like to be a man first born into Spartan society? Well, first, you would be, as soon as you were born, on the very day of your birth, you would either be, they would send for a group of elders from the community called the ephors. And each baby would be carefully examined. If the baby was found to have any disabilities, to be weak, any deformities, if the baby was just small or sickly looking, the baby would be left on a hillside or in the forest to die exposed to the elements. The Spartans had no time for any sort of weakness. They wanted only perfection. So if you survived that very harrowing first day as a Spartan, right, you'd be raised in the house of, as a Spartan boy, you'd be raised until the age of 6 in your mother's house. And then at the age of 6, the men would come and they would take you to a state school for training. The school was called the agoge. And in the agoge, you'd learn the basics of reading and writing, but the vast amount of your time would be spent in training, in physical exercise. The boys were organized into little troops and would elect captains of their own. And physical exercise in running, wrestling, boxing, weightlifting, right, were how they spent most of their days. All of that to get them to achieve that physical strength that a warriors would need. But warriors also needed to be tough. And so if you were a boy in ancient Sparta, you weren't given any shoes to start with. You went barefoot everywhere, right? Whether it was on rocky hill slopes in the summer or walking through the snow, you wore no shoes because warriors needed to be tough, and men needed to be tough to face the world they were in. You also weren't issued any clothes. Once a year, you would simply be given a cloak, really just a blanket you could wrap around yourself and pin, and that was all the clothes that you'd be issued for a year. So through cold winters and hot summers, you'd be naked almost everywhere you went with very little protection. And if that wasn't enough, for you, well, they also didn't feed you enough. And that was intentional. They purposely starved the boys so that they wouldn't get quite enough food to eat. Now that might seem counterintuitive. You would think, well, if you want warriors, you feed them as much as possible so they get big and strong. But Spartans also felt that this was important because warriors also needed to be stealthy and resourceful. And so Spartan boys, after a full day of training, would have to sneak out of their barracks at night and go into the woods to either trap or hunt game, or sneak and crouch through the city, climbing into Spartan kitchens to steal enough food for themselves to eat and for their comrades back at their barracks. Now, everyone knew that this is what was happening and that this was the plan, but that didn't mean that if you got caught, you weren't going to be whipped for being caught in the first place, right? We expected better of you than to be caught stealing, right? And so the Spartan youths had to go through this constant competitive atmosphere where they were competing constantly against one another and being pushed to challenge one another to greater fitness and greater heroism. And in fact, everything you learned as a Spartan boy would be meant to push this idea on you, right, that you needed to prepare yourself, that your ancestors were greater than you, and that you could barely live up to them if you really worked hard. The most famous Spartan boy, and he's unnamed, right, was a Spartan boy who snuck out of his barracks at night, and he went into the woods and managed to capture a fox in a trap. And so he took the fox and stuck it in a sack, put the sack under his cloak, and was carrying it back to his barracks so that his barracks mates could cook it and eat it with him. And while he was there, he was caught by a Spartan officer who berated and screamed at the boy, who demanded to know why he was out of bed and who else knew, who else had helped him to escape his barracks. The boy stood there impassively and said nothing, as the man chewed him out for almost a half an hour before he finally let him go. And finally, when the boy got back to his barracks, he entered in to his squad mates, took the fox out from under his cloak, handed it to them, and fell down dead. Only then they pulled back the cloak to reveal that while he had been standing there being chewed out by his Spartan sergeant, the fox had escaped from the bag and, pressed against his stomach, had begun to gnaw and bite and chew at the boy and had torn open his stomach and his intestines. And this was told to the Spartan youths as a great story. This boy had lived up to everything a Spartan should value, because he hadn't, even being torn apart by a wild animal, he hadn't betrayed any of his companions. And he hadn't shown any sign of the pain that he was enduring. And so as a Spartan boy, you were expected to simply accept that, right, and do that. And we know many of the Spartan boys in the competitions who couldn't manage up often committed suicide rather than face the shame of being sent back to their family, of not having lived up. So you would spend that time in the Goge being trained, right, through hard runs and mountain climbs, carrying heavy weights and stones, give missions, until finally at 20, you were allowed to join the army. And then you went and you fought for your city in the Spartan force. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the army that you would be eventually training for. Excuse me, I don't mean to. Can I get that bottle of water? Mouth's a little dry, I apologize. So a new type of warfare had revolutionized Greece at this time and changed. It's often called the Hoplite Revolution. If you read in the Iliad, right, if you remember the Iliad and the Odyssey, right, it talks about the great war between Troy and the Greek states. But that story is definitely a story about individual heroes, Menelaus and Agamemnon, right, Ajax and Achilles, Ulysses and Aeneas, and the mighty Hector. Right? The story is clearly about individual warriors, and when they describe the battle is really just duels between these individual champions, right? Fighting between one another. And so this became this really reflected how warfare had been fought in ancient times, which was really just the few chieftains with armor could fight one another, and that was really warfare. But at the time of the Spartans, the Bronze Age had changed. And new technology and new weapons had come in, and you were training to become this new Greek soldier, which was called a hoplite. And it so influenced the world, the hoplites would be the dominant military force for the next 200 years until the coming of Alexander. So the hoplites were known famously, so this is what, this here is the shield, right, called the hoplon, from where we get the name hoplite. And they were planks of oak with bronze spread over it. The shield itself weighed about 45 to 50 pounds just in itself. And so it required a lot of strength training just to be able to carry it. But this massive shield that you held in front of you covered you from your chin down to your knees. On your head, you also wore a helmet that could be as much as 8 pounds, depending on how much they decorated it up, of solid bronze. And then you wore a chest plate over that was either bronze or laminated cloaks of linen that was very heavy but very tough. And then you'd wear metal greaves to protect your legs. The result of this was that each of these individual warriors were almost invulnerable from the front. The problem was that with all this heavy gear that you were carrying, it made you vulnerable. You were slow and couldn't turn fast enough, so you were vulnerable from being attacked from either side or from the rear if you were wearing all this heavy armor. And so a new style of warfare developed in Greece, and that was called the Phalanx. In other words, to group together all of these men so that they could each protect the flank. So instead of individual warriors, you stand in a line with your shield protecting yourself and the men next to you. And then men stand behind you helping to push, right? So the Greeks carried these massive shields. They also carried 2 8-foot spears and a 2-foot stabbing sword with them as their typical gear. And this great formation called the Phalanx, these blocks of men, were like the tanks of the ancient world that would go crashing into the forces against them. And just the sheer weight and drive and the fact that their armor could stop just about anything that was thrown at them, right, made them nearly invincible. But they also required that everyone pulled their weight. You needed everyone to cooperate. You had stood for the man next to you. If you turned and fled, you weren't just leaving yourself vulnerable, you were leaving the man next to you. And so they had to encourage a lot of camaraderie and a lot of training. This learning to move around in these huge blocks units was difficult. It took incredible amounts of effort, so drill and training was required to be able to fight in this style of warfare, and the Spartans were the best at it because they dedicated their lives to perfecting this because they thought that war was the highest expression of honor and glory that could be achieved. So before we move on, so what can you expect? Well, at 20, you'd join the military, and you'd spend another 10 years in the military. At 30, you'd stay in the military, but you were allowed to get married at 30. And so you'd be married at the age of 30, but usually you didn't leave your barracks, right? You'd join one of these, you'd stay with your unit. The men would continue to stay in their barracks with their wives at home. And Spartan men almost seemed like visitors, right? Just visiting their home occasionally to see their wives and then going back to their military barracks to be. So what if you were a girl when you were born? What about women in Sparta? What was their life like? Well, I probably am not going to surprise any of you to tell you that life wasn't always the best for girls in ancient Greece. Right? Things didn't always go so well for them. In fact, for instance, if you were an Athenian girl, you could expect, number one, that you wouldn't be educated. You would never learn to read and write. You would spend the entirety of your life in your home unless you were accompanied by a male chaperone. At 14 or 15 years old, you'd be married to a man that your father chose for you, who was probably in his 40s or 50s at the time that he got married. And so you could expect to never really have true freedom. You couldn't participate in politics. You couldn't go to plays. Right? It just wasn't seemly for you to be seen out in public in Athens. And Athenian women were actually so sequestered that the Athenian women actually spoke a slightly different dialect of Attican Greek than the men did, right? Because they only spoke to each other and to their household servants. And so that's how the partition was. But if you were a girl in Sparta, relative to that, you were actually given quite an amount of freedom. First of all, Spartan girls went through the same trial at birth as Spartan boys, right? They'd be tested. If there was anything wrong with them, they would immediately be left out and exposed. So only healthy and strong girls would be brought in to the Spartan community. And Spartan women were famous for their beauty. If you remember reading in the Iliad, the famous Helen of Troy, who was supposed to be the most beautiful woman in the world, was a Spartan princess. And part of the reason for that beauty of the Spartan women was that Spartan girls would also be taken at 6 to a state school, where they'd learn to read and to write. And just like the boys, a lot of their education centered around the same physical exercise that the boys did. Visitors to Sparta would often be scandalized when they approached the city and saw girls and boys exercising outside naked together. That was just not done. But Spartan women were expected to maintain a perfect physique as much as they could and to be strong, right? They did running, gymnastics, dance, even wrestling and combat sports, just like the boys, because the Spartans believed that strong women would give birth to strong sons. And we know that Spartan women took a little bit of pride in their physique. and their appearance, because many of the other Greek states that recorded it make fun of the Spartan women's clothing, which was usually sleeveless, and their skirts were always a little too short. Or they had too highs, they were slit too high up the thigh. In fact, the Athenian nickname for Spartan women literally translates out to those that show the thigh, right? Because they wore clothes that showed off their legs when they walked. And so this was quite a scandal for them, but also girls were, in a sense, in Sparta, more educated than the boys were. Because while the boys were constantly off training, the women had to be trained on how to run the household while they were gone. Right? The Spartans were able to support their community on the backs of slavery, they called helots, right, who worked for the Spartans. And as a Spartan woman, you would have to run the household. Spartan women, unlike Athenian women, couldn't be married without their permission. And so there was a much likely chance that you got to decide whether or not you wanted to marry the man that was chosen for you. And so we had a better opportunity that this might be actual love in a Spartan marriage. But the Spartan woman had to run everything. The man was constantly off training or on campaign. And who was going to run the household? Well, she did, right? She had to manage all the crops coming in, discipline the servants, and save the money to pay for the expensive armor and goods, right, that her husband and sons needed in order to fight Sparta's enemies. And so I think most of us can maybe sympathize. A lot of other Greeks joked that the Spartan men had to always go to their women for permission to do anything. I know even today, if I'm going to make a big purchase, I have to get my wife's permission first. I think we can all sympathize with the Spartans, but Spartan women, right, really ran the show for their husbands. And the men would often have to come and request help from them. There's a famous quote quoted by Plutarch asking the wife of Leonidas, an Athenian woman asked her, "Why is it that only Spartan women get to rule men?" And Leonidas' wife answered quite cleverly, "Because only Spartan women give birth to real men." Right? And this shows a little bit of the focus of a Spartan woman's life, though. Your chief goal as a Spartan woman was to give birth to strong children that would make Sparta stronger, especially sons who could meet that warrior ethos. And if you think women weren't just as driven as the men for their city-state, there's a famous quote said that Spartan mothers would say to their sons and husbands as they set off to war. And that was, in warfare, the heaviest piece of armor that a soldier carried was his shield. So if a man ran from the battlefield, the first thing he'd do is throw away his shield so he could run away quicker. But if he was killed on the battlefield, then his companions would lay him on top of his shield and carry him back to the city. And so Spartan mothers said to their sons and husbands, "Come back with your shield or on it." Now, today we find it difficult to imagine a mother saying that to her son and putting her city in front of a mother's love for a child. But a Spartan woman could understand that devotion. A Spartan woman could survive mourning the loss of a husband or son who was killed in battle, but she couldn't endure having raised a son who failed Sparta and his companions and who'd run away at battle. And so, out of this society, they produced the greatest warriors in the ancient world. The Spartans were feared by everyone in the Greek world who looked on at them with confusion. So what were the traits that Spartan men had? Well, the thing that the Spartans were known for is, number one, the Spartans didn't care what anybody else thought about them. And they didn't care, certainly, about any of the fashion or entertainment of their day. The Spartans wore clothing and hairstyles that were old and out of fashion. They were constantly berated for being backwoods, for not being educated and cosmopolitan like the other cities, but the Spartans didn't care. Right? They were confident in their own way of life. Right? That their rhea, their path of life had been set out for them. And they dedicated everything to that perfection. Unlike a lot of the other things, the other thing Spartans were famous for was their virtue. Plato once commented about something he witnessed at one of the Pan-Hellenic Games, like the precursor to our modern Olympics. And Plato was sitting in the stands of an amphitheater, and the seats were all packed full of the different cities that had come, and each city sat in its own section. And after it was all full up, Plato watched as an old man stumbled on a cane, walked down the steps, looking for a seat. And when he got to the Spartan section, the entire Spartan body stood up together and all slid over to make a seat for him. And Plato would remark about that and say, all men know what they should do, but only the Spartans do it. The other thing Spartans were known for in their time too was what we call today a laconic wit. If anyone ever heard that expression? If you say someone has a laconic wit, we get the word laconic from Lacedaemonia, the place where Spartans are from. Someone with a laconic wit is someone who can say something that's clever or insightful or brilliant in the fewest words possible. And the Spartans didn't like to talk. They were the strong silent type, if there ever was one. And this was in contrast to all the other Greeks. The Athenians loved to debate and argue politics and philosophy with one another. Right? Corinth was full of used car salesmen and fast-talking merchants. Right? And the Thespians never shut up. But the Spartans cultivated a certain wit that was essentially the ethos of, if you don't have to say anything, don't. And if you must speak, speak less. The most famous example of this was when Philip of Macedon had conquered most of Greece. He's the father of Alexander the Great. He sent a letter to the Spartans demanding their surrender. And his letter ran essentially like this. He said, if you will not surrender, then I will bring my army into the Peloponnese. And if I bring my army, you'll have to face me in battle. And if I defeat you in battle, then I will burn Sparta to the ground. The Spartan response was only one word. If. Right? Which is a very clever response to that threat. And so they cultivated this. So now that we understand a little bit of the world that we're in, let's talk about the battle and what happened. So in 480 BC, the most of the known world is ruled by this guy over here, right? By Xerxes. Now, Xerxes is the emperor, but he's the emperor by birth. Right? He's been raised in the courts, in the royal cities at Susa and Persepolis. He's the son of the previous emperor, Darius. And Darius was a great conqueror who'd ruled and made quite a name for himself. But Xerxes was not Darius's only son. In fact, he had several older brothers who were far more accomplished than he was. And yet, when Darius died, Xerxes was chosen by the court to be the next emperor, specifically because his older brothers, who were more capable and able than he was, had all been born of commoners. And his mother was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, right? The famous Persian conqueror who freed the Jews in the Bible. And so he had this great lineage, and so because of that, simply because of his birth, he was chosen, right, to be the greatest man in the world. Now, unlike the Egyptians, the Persians didn't believe their emperors were gods, but they felt that it was about as close as you could come to it, I think. And so he had been raised in these courts and had been surrounded by people who had always told him of his own greatness, that he was blessed by the sun and the moon and the stars, right? That he was the son of great sires and would do great things. But he had never really accomplished anything in the course of his life. And this really weighed on him. And so Xerxes decided that he needed to strike out on his own and prove that he could be, right, a great leader as his father was. And so to do that, he decided to avenge a defeat from his father. His father Darius had only suffered one defeat during his entire reign, and that was against the city of Athens. There were many Greek cities that were that were Persian subjects, and when one of these Greek cities rebelled, the free Athenians had sent aid to help. And so Darius had sent a fleet and invaded with the intention of destroying Athens, and to his great embarrassment was badly defeated by an army of Athenian hoplites. And he returned back to Asia Minor, and he always planned that he was going to raise another force and complete the conquest, but he died before he could ever do that. And so Xerxes saw this as his opportunity to make a name for himself and to avenge his father. And so in 480, he sets out. And he sends out an order to every realm of his kingdom, calling in troops that are all subject to him. He's chosen tribesmen from Afghanistan, Arabian soldiers, men from Egypt, even Ethiopians who come painted with half their bodies painted white and half painted red, and from Greece, Sumerians, Babylonians, Akkadians, right? From the 1,000 nations of the Persian Empire, he draws this massive army. Now, Herodotus, as I said earlier, would say that army was 1.7. That's probably, most historians say that's an exaggeration. But it's certainly likely that the army roughly at least 500,000 men, which was still the largest army that had ever, our entire US army, both active and non, is only 300,000. And so he conscripted more men than that and marched on Greece. So how is he different, right, from his opponent on the other side, from King Leonidas? Well, Sparta always had two kings and two different royal families. And the purpose was to keep either king from getting too much power, right? The Spartans believed in checks and balances just as Americans do with our Constitution. And so Leonidas, though, but the boys who were raised from these royal families, they went to the agoge like everybody else. And in fact, there was more pressure on them to train them harder and to prepare them, because the greatest job of a Spartan general was to lead his troops in the field. And so one king would stay home and the other would march out. And so by the time Leonidas comes to this battle at Thermopylae, he already knows all the men that he's fighting with. He's trained with them for years. Spartan kings didn't sit in the back and watch. They stood in the front lines with their men. And they had earned their men's respect, because their men know that they had gone through all the great suffering and sacrifices that they had gone through. Contrast that with Xerxes, who, while the battle is going on, is sitting on a golden throne being fanned and drinking wine as he watches the battle going. And so, what happened? Well, the Persian army comes and prepares to cross the Hellespont into what is Europe. And the rallying place for the Persian army is a place called Sardis, a city that's near the coast in modern-day Turkey. And at this city, he marches in. And Herodotus tells us this interesting story that tells us a little bit about what Herodotus felt was Xerxes' great fault and what made him different from the Greeks. And when he arrives in Sardis, there's a governor there who's an absolute monarch, right? Just everyone, there's no limits on the power of what a king can do. And the governor, or a satrap, as they were called, says to him, I want you to succeed in Greece. I have my life savings in gold, and I'm going to go donate it all to you so that you can use it in the conquest of Greece. And Xerxes says, well, how much do you have? He says, well, I have 4 million gold pieces less 8,000. And immediately Xerxes calls for his bookkeeper and says, give this man 8,000 pieces of gold. This is how I reward my friends. And so he could be generous, but moved by this generosity, the next day, as the army is preparing to set out, there's an ill omen. Right? The night before, there'd been an eclipse of the moon, and this was seen as a terrible omen, but everyone assured Xerxes it wasn't about his defeat, he should go. But moved by his generosity, this same satrap comes to him and says, I'm sending 4 of my sons with you on this battle to go fight with you in Greece. Will you leave me my oldest son and let him remain, so that in case all of my sons are killed, I'll still have one son left to tend to me in my old age and for me to pass my name on to. And Xerxes says, you want your son to stay here? Fine. And he orders his guards to take him, and with the father watching, with a massive sword, he splits the man's son in two. And then he takes both halves and he nails them to the gates as his army marches out. Now, Herodotus includes this story to remind us what it's like to live under a tyrant, to live under an absolute despot who can do whatever he wants to do. He could be generous or he could be brutal, and there was no rules or discipline or anything to keep him. And how different this was from the Greeks, who had to debate and argue and vote on all the things that they did. And so the other thing that Herodotus felt was Xerxes' great flaw was hubris, right? Hubris is outrageous arrogance. Anytime someone is setting themselves up like a god, well, they're due for a fall. And so as he reaches the Hellespont, he set ahead a group of engineers that built a bridge of ships across the Hellespont. But as the army got there, the Hellespont's known for having terrible weather, and a storm blew up and great waves tore the bridge apart and threw them back. So Xerxes immediately first brought forward all the engineers and had them all beheaded for failing to make a strong enough bridge. But then he sent men down to the river, down to the Hellespont with whips, and ordered them to lash the ocean, to give it 300 lashes. Now, that might seem silly to us, but the symbolic meaning, what Xerxes is trying to convey is, even the earth and the air and the ocean needs to obey my will. And so I'll punish it and make it obey me, right? That's hubris. And yet, so a stronger bridge is built, and he crosses over into the Hellespont. And let me go back a little bit. And the Greeks are taken almost completely by surprise. They knew that this army was coming. The first word they got from it was that Xerxes sent to every Greek city ambassadors who came and demanded a tribute from every city in Greece. And the tribute that they asked for was earth and water. And that was symbolic of saying, tribute to me your land and your lives, and I'll spare you. And many of the Greek cities, either cowed by the Persian power or tempted by the money and gifts that were promised to them, went over to the Persian side and were ready to fight with the Persians. In fact, when Sparta would call for a great council and ask what cities will come to defend Greece, of the roughly 120 Greek city-states, only 31 agreed to sign on and to send soldiers to help defend Greece. And so, with the army arriving, the Spartans are trying to prepare and organize for their defense. But they know that at best, all they can do is stall. The armies arrive. They plan to have at least 60,000 soldiers in the field, but that's going to take at least until next year to get them organized. And Xerxes' army has traveled much faster than they thought was possible and is now in Greece. And so someone must go and make a stand and hope to block or prevent the Persians from entering Greece. And so they meet with this council, these 31 cities, and they make a plan. And they decide to make a stand at a place right here called Thermopylae on the Melian Bay. Right? And here it's a narrow pass where they know Xerxes' army is going to have to pass. If they don't go through the pass there, they have to go all the way back up Thessaly and through these trackless mountains, and they'll never make it down. So they know at this place, right, is where Xerxes is going to be. And so each of the cities sends what soldiers they have ready. And they march through, and they take up the place at the pass at Thermopylae. Altogether, the cities send 7,000 Greek hoplites to hold the pass at Thermopylae against an army of at least 500,000 men. But they choose this site because it's narrow, and the Persians will have to come up to them slowly, a little at a time. They can't simply surround them with bigger numbers or use their cavalry. They have to climb up through the mountain on the thing and then face them here. So this is the plains of Thermopylae today. Unfortunately, in the last 2,000 years, erosion and agriculture has kind of brought all this down. So originally, this would be a cliffside that would fall down to the ocean. And this was about 150 yards of open space. You can still see the remains of the wall that the Greeks built there to hold the pass at Thermopylae. And the steep sides of this mountain, the Kyrandros, is just impassable. And so they know that here the Spartans are going to have to come to them a few at a time, and they can hold this pass. So As they arrive, at first, Xerxes can't believe what he's seeing, right? He sees this massive army that he's brought, and he sees such a tiny force there in front of him. And he waits. He expects the Greeks are either going to, once they see the size of his army, they'll either retreat or flee. He waits 4 days and finds that the Greeks aren't moving. And so he sends a message to Leonidas, to the Spartans. And the message says this. He says, "Clearly, you see your cause is hopeless. But I have no desire to destroy your army. I will send your soldiers home with pockets full of gold, and I'll make your captains the greatest men in all of Greece. All that I demand is that you deliver up your arms." The response comes back from Leonidas, and it's only 2 words in Greek. Melon labe. Come and get them. And so the battle commences at the pass. There's the Greek word written, melon labe. And he sends forth, and so first Xerxes sends forth what we would call his 3rd-tier troops, right? Troops that are conscript soldiers from all over the empire are driven up the hill to fight to face the Spartans. The Spartans, not only do they not retreat, they go over the wall and hold the ground in front of the wall, forcing the soldiers to march up the pass and charge straight into the teeth of the Spartan lines. And the Spartans massacre them. And wave after wave of soldiers from different nations and tribes are brought up and hurled against the Spartans and their Greek allies, and each one is sent back down the hill in a bloody mess. Finally, in desperation, as we're watching this, 3 times Xerxes leaps up from his seat, afraid that these Spartans are going to sweep down and take his entire army. But each time new troops are brought up, and they're beaten back. And by the end of the day, the field is so covered with bodies and with blood that not a blade of grass can be seen. And the Spartans and the Greek allies have held the wall. Well, the next day, Xerxes is distraught and he's angry. He has many of his captains beheaded that night to make sure to send the clear message, right, that they had failed. And so he sends forth his best troops, the core of the Persian army, which are Medes and Persians. And he sends them up the pass. And the Medes and Persians charge, and they fight bravely. But again, the Spartans and the Greeks drive them back. And each time they fall back, the Spartans begin to use tactics, right? The Greeks will charge forward and chase them down the hill, and then sound a trumpet and start fleeing back towards the wall. And seeing this, the Persians and Medes charge forward, thinking that they're going to win, only to have the Spartans immediately turn back around and drive right back down into them, having drawn them back up to the wall. And so at the end, and so by midday of the 2nd day, again, Xerxes is terrified. He can't understand how this tiny army has crushed his, and he says to one of his companions, "My army has many men, but few warriors." And so finally, he commits his warriors. He commits his most crack troops, the greatest troops in the world at that time, the 10,000 Immortals. Leonidas keeps switching out the troops, so as men fight and become tired, the troops from other cities take their place. And inspired by the Spartans' courage, all of the Greek city-states fight like lions and drive back the attack. And finally, the Immortals are sent forward. There's 10,000 of them, and they're called the 10,000 Immortals because the number of them was always counted. And after a battle, if any of them were killed, they immediately put trained recruits back in to replace them. So there was always 10,000. They were the best armed, and they were the personal guard of the Persian emperor. And the Immortals drive up the hill, and they fight. Now, unlike the Spartans and the other Greeks who are carrying bronze weapons and bronze armor, right, the Immortals have wicker shields, right? It was great to help them move fast on an open plain, but here they're driven forward in a narrow gap where they have to run straight at the Spartan lines. And as they get close, they quickly learn their spears aren't even long enough to reach the Greeks. And so as they approach, they're repeatedly gored by rank after rank of spears. Men desperately grab hold of the spears, trying to pull them away, but they fight all day with terrible slaughter. But the Immortals never retreat, and they fight until darkness finally ends the battle, and the Greeks once again hold the wall. Though by this time, at least a third of their number is either killed or wounded. And they're running out of supplies and weapons. Their spears are broken, but they still hold the wall. And finally, at the camp of the Persians that night, Xerxes is again distraught and beside himself. What are we going to do with these Spartans? How can we not defeat them? We've thrown everything we have at them. And he begins to sulk. He drinks and calls in women to help him feel better. But then this scruffy little man is dragged in by one of his guards. And they say, "Sire, I think we have someone you want to talk to." And so the man is brought forward, and the emperor certainly puts out his toe for the man to kiss. And the man is a shepherd, a Greek named Ephialtes, who lives in the region here. And he says, in return for a roomful of silver, he says, "I know something. I track all over these mountains with my sheep." "Well, I don't care about your sheep." "Well, you do care about what I know. Because I know of a secret path, a goat trail that leads around the mountain behind the Spartan position. And in return for silver, I'll lead your troops around, and you can surround the Spartans." And so if you go to Thermopylae today, you can still walk that goat trail. It's still a steep climb, but this betraying Greek, Ephialtes, leads the Immortals on a night march around the Spartan position, and they come up. Now, Leonidas is aware of this track, and he's left a group, 1,000 warriors from the city of Phocia, to hold the place, to hold the opening to the pass. And about 5:30 in the morning, as the first sun begins to rise, the Phocians hear a sound, like a shuffling or like a strong wind, and realize it's the 10,000 Immortals trotting on the leaves as they charge. Now, there's a funny exchange between Ephialtes and the general of the Immortals before they charge. As seeing the Phocians putting on their armor and running to defend their place, the Immortals refuse to charge because they're afraid that they might be Spartans. And only after they're assured, no, these are not Spartans, these are from a different city, do they agree to lead a charge in. And immediately the Phocians begin to be pushed back by these Immortals, and they send a message to Leonidas, saying, "We've been undone. We can't hold this pass they're going to drive us from our position." Now, Leonidas, it said, already was expecting the news to come, because he brought with him a soothsayer, a man who could tell the future. And every morning they would tear open a sheep and examine its liver to try to discern what the gods wanted for that day. And so this man tears open a sheep, holds up his liver and examines it, and then shakes his head and says to Leonidas, "We die today." And so now, seeing that the pass can't be held, Leonidas calls together all of the remaining Greek captains. And he tells them, he says, "We fought here because here the Persians couldn't surround us and we could make use of our numbers, but we can't hold the pass from both sides. And so go home. Greece will need your spears at another day." He says, "Sparta has given us command of this army and ordered us to hold this pass, and they've given us no orders that we can withdraw. So go. But if we all leave, if we all retreat with you, then the Persians will catch us on the plains beyond, and the entire army will be wiped out. So somebody has to stay up here and hold the pass as long as they can, so the rest of the army can escape. And we're the Spartans, and we can hold it longer than anyone." And so the rest of the Greeks take up their weapons and their gear and trek down the mountain, leaving the remaining of the 300 Spartans to hold the pass. Only one other city, the little city of Thespis, with 80 men sent, stays. And the Spartans say to them, "We said go." And they said, "We stay because you stay." And so together they take up their positions ready to hold. Now the Thespians were famous for talking a lot, right? Even that's why even today actors are called thespians, right? They were famous for never shutting up. And one of them, seeing the approaching army, said, "They're bringing up archers. The Persians will fire so many arrows it'll blot out the sky." And a Spartan sergeant overhearing him says, "Good, then we can fight in the shade." And so once again, and now attacked from both sides, the armies of the Persian siege forward and rush the Spartan lines. And they hold the position for several hours, still managing to drive back. It says that many of the Persians who are conscripts, who don't really want to fight, actually have their sergeants with whips, whipping them on to make sure they go and fight the Spartans. But little by little, the Spartans give way. And in this fighting around the wall, Leonidas is killed. And a great battle begins around the body of Leonidas. For Xerxes has promised a great treasure to anyone who can bring him the head of Leonidas. And so back and forth they fight. 4 times they surge back and forth over the body until the Spartans grab the body of their king, and they retreat up onto a little rocky hill called Kolonos. And there they make their final stand. And true to the words of the thespian, the Persians bring up their archers. And now the Spartans still fighting, still most of them with their shields, swords, and spears broken, are hurling rocks down at the oncoming men and tackling them and fighting them bare hands, throttling them around the base of the mountain. But finally, in a hail of arrows, the archers open up, and every last Spartan and every last thespian dies on the hill. And we're able to confirm this historical event. Modern historians and archaeologists who have gone there have searched that hill with metal detectors. And what do they find? Broken spear points and thousands of bronze arrow tips from where the men fell. And so there was the great last stand of the Spartans. But that wouldn't be the end of the war. So although this was a victory, many of the other cities looking on at Sparta would be convinced to switch sides and would join the league for the next season to fight. Xerxes himself is so demoralized by it, he doesn't want to fight any more battles on land. He's afraid to face another Spartan force anywhere on land. And so he commits instead his naval force to a pointless and stupid battle, which didn't need to be fought. And the Greek fleet completely annihilates his force, leaving him without any ships or supplies. Xerxes then says, "Well, time for me to go home." And so he leaves his generals in charge and tells them, "I'm going home, but you stay here and wrap this thing up." So while he returns back to the Persian Empire, the following season, another army of Greek patriots, this time led by Pausanias, the brother of Leonidas, charges the field at Plataea and destroys the Persian, ending the Persian threat forever. And this would begin a decline for the Persians that would eventually lead in their conquest by Greek forces under Alexander the Great. So what can we learn from this? What can we take from what these men did and from their great stand? Well, I'd like to think that these Spartans make us ask certain questions about ourselves, about what's worth dying for and what's worth living for. Are there things that we should ask ourselves, are there things that you believe in that you'd be willing to die for? Or more importantly, are there things you'd be willing to live for and to dedicate your whole life towards giving? Would you be willing to do that for your country, for your family? What about honor or virtue? And what are you doing, we should ask yourselves, to cultivate that in your own life and in your communities, in your families? Are you teaching your children of the values that you want them to learn and preparing them for what comes? All of these questions are asked by the sacrifice made by these 300 Spartans. If you go there today, on top of that hill at Kolonos, there stands a marker that was there, that's been there since ancient times. It has a new marker on it now, but on it are the words of Simonides, a Greek poet that wrote this. Where they're buried, it says, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that obedient to her laws, here we lie. So I hope we can all take some thought for that, right? For what sacrifice truly means and what we're willing to do to improve our own lives and make our own countries great. And I share this with you. Thank you very much.
Justin Heap. Justin Heap. Thank you very much. Outstanding.
Okay.
Oh, he got a kiss from his wife. That was awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much, Justin. I kind of identified him online while he was talking as the new history teacher for Listen University, because he likes that stuff, doesn't he? I think if we asked him to share, am I wrong, Chris, that he has other stories? Yeah, that's kind of what I was guessing, was that he has a real love for history. And so thank you, Justin, for sharing. It was great to have you here tonight. Make sure we get your pictures before you leave so we can put you up on our wall of fame over there. For all of you who are here tonight, our friend Jack Zufelt sent you books that you can take home. The DNA of Success is a bestseller that you're really going to enjoy. Know what you want to get what you want. Outstanding. Thank you, Jack. He's watching tonight. And thank you, Jack. Yeah, thank Jack for us. And we appreciate it. Thanks very much. We'll see you here next Thursday night. Thanks, everybody.